Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Season 8 is all about the re-enchanting Inklings. How do we rebuild, renew, and restore culture? The Inklings give us a model. I want to ask for your help in two ways. You're probably watching this episode on X or on YouTube. Please find and follow us on both platforms. I tweet as @TheOptimisticC3, and then if you're looking for the show on YouTube, just search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want you to be able to find and follow our content and then be able to share that across your platforms. We want to be part of the conversation and help other people to see how life is truly good, true, and beautiful. And now, on to this week's episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Rhys Laverty, Senior Managing Editor at Davenant Press and Director of Communications at the Davenant Institute. He edited the just published Life on the Silent Planet, Essays on Christian Living from C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, out now from Davenant Press. He lives in Chessington in the United Kingdom with his wife Libby and their 3 children. You can follow Rhys on Twitter at @RDLaverty. Rhys, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Good to be with you, Josh. You've given my surname a nice sort of French-sounding twist there, Laverty. It's Laverty, first syllable.
Laverty.
Hit the trochee.
Oh, I apologize. I am. This may already poison our burgeoning friendship, but I'm a bit of a Francophile.
It's
so
far from the worst I've had from an American in pronouncing any part of my name. So don't worry about it.
You are very gracious. Well, before we get into the book and Lewis, tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and I'd love to know how you got connected with Davenant and really what got you into Lewis.
Yeah, sure. So I live in Chessington, which is a suburb on the very, very edge of London. We're literally like the very edge of what anyone could technically call London, and no one here really thinks that they live in London. About half an hour by train from the centre of town. And this is where I grew up. So my parents and various family members all live in very close proximity to me here. I have been working with the Davenant Institute now for just over 4 years. Started in September 2020, initially doing communications, which is still part of what I do, but most of my job now is on the editing side of things. So with the press, doing our books, as you mentioned. Also, I'm the senior editor for Ad Fontes, which is our journal. You can find that at adfontesjournal.com, excuse me. And so I've been working with the Davenant Institute for all that time. As for Lewis, I talk about some of this in the introduction to Life on the Silent Planet, which I think we'll talk about a bit more as we go on. But I was converted at the age of 12, my first year of secondary school or middle school would be for you guys, through the witness of my uncle, who was the youth worker at the church I still attend. Pretty much early on had Lewis thrust into my hand. For me, it was a case of kind of being converted and then feeling the need to do lots of apologetics shortly after to like rationalize my decision to myself. I'm pretty sure in my early teens, I read Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, read plenty more throughout my teens. By the time I was at university, The Great Divorce was my favorite. Had obviously read Narnia as a kid. Regarded myself as relatively handy with Lewis by the time I was sort of coming to the end of my undergrad. But as anyone knows, I'm sure many of your listeners know, there's an infinite amount to continue getting into. And so it's just an ongoing process. And when we get to talking about the book, we'll talk about, I guess, getting into the Ransom Trilogy.
Well, Lewis's writings are so capacious. I mean, it's difficult to really get even a total list of them. It seems like every year there's new letters, new essays, people find, even new photographs and so on.
Stuff in collections and university archives or still
there's
away.
Always more.
I know you know this, like surprising stuff, in terms of how sort of significant it would be if you know Lewis, that you hear about this thing that exists in an archive somewhere and you're like, my goodness, how has that not seen the light of day?
Right. Well, and even now there's even increasing interest in those around Lewis. I know a couple years ago, a friend of mine, Paul Krause, he edits the website and journal Vagal and View. He asked me to review letters from a friend, a study of the correspondence between Lewis and Arthur Greaves. And I just found that a fascinating read. And then as I got into my own dissertation work, I discovered there is an equally capacious secondary body of literature around Lewis, and it too seems to be never ending. There's always more people who are interested in getting into Lewis. And
yeah, a lot of it's crap, but don't tell anybody that.
Well, I'm going to wait until I will wait until I manage to be somewhat more established before I start throwing those kinds of views out myself. But I will say I have infinite respect for an American historian named David Hackett Fisher. He wrote a book in I believe the 70s that was called Historians' Fallacies. He defended his dissertation, and then his first book was under, I believe it was like being under consideration for publication. Then he beat that one to publication with this tell-all book that just tore the previous generation of historians apart for all of their logical flaws. I'm not yet at the point where I want to do that, but it seems to me there are so many folks who are passionate about Lewis, and then everybody's kind of got a story about how they got there. So I appreciate you telling us yours. Well, I know. My first experience with the Davenant Institute was when I came to a convivium that was in South Carolina that was confusingly labeled Faith and the Imagination. I thought, oh, those are two things I'm very interested in. There may have been something about literature in the description, and I got there and discovered that was code. All the people who had been affiliated with Davenant before knew those are the key words for come to a Lewis event. And, they were all big fans of Lewis. So I know the Davenant Institute, in general, seems to have a concern for the connections between literature and theology and Lewis. And then Davenant Press is looking to publish works on Lewis scholarship. So talk to us a bit for why is that? Why do you see a need for more works of Lewis scholarship? What's missing in the status quo?
Yeah, great question. A number of reasons. So I realize we're a few minutes in. For anyone who doesn't know, I haven't really said much about what the Davenant Institute is or what our mission is. So the Davenant Institute exists to retrieve the riches of classical Protestantism, to renew and build up the contemporary church. Three main ways we do that. We publish books, both primary sources, Reformation era, other historic sources, in new editions, and we also publish original works such as Life on the Silent Planet, this book of essays on Lewis, and other things. We have our journal, and we have an educational wing, Davenant Hall, which runs degree programs and online classes, and also a student in our Master of Letters program. And our mission is retrieving the riches of classical Protestantism. Sometimes we shorten that to say we retrieve Christian wisdom. And really, it grew out of a desire to show that the Protestant tradition is full of intellectual weight and resources. Often there's what my former colleague Onsi Camel has called a Roman Catholic intellectual ecosystem. We wanted to kind of prove that Protestantism has all it needs to create a truly robust Protestant intellectual ecosystem. And part of that is retrieving an older model of Christian wisdom and education. Is really what we're trying to do at Davenant Hall, where Christian theological education, and we're reimagining theological education at Davenant Hall. Christian theological education, it isn't just your Bible classes and a bit of systematics, but is a richly integrated intellectual whole where there is close scriptural study, languages, dogmatics, systematics, study of doctrine, but also philosophy, because theologians throughout church history have used philosophical thinking, philosophical resources to underpin and kind of cohere what they do. Literature, you read through even someone from the Protestant tradition who you would think is, less of a great intellectual, let's say like John Newton, for example, an Anglican, but like a nonconformist in so many ways, father of, hugely influential in the nonconformist tradition. But you read Newton's sermons and he's pulling quotes from Ovid and, all these kind of classical, and he's an autodidact. This is stuff he read on ships and a little bit in grammar school, I think he has to be pulled out of. So, even Newton in his sort of education had this much more rounded experience. So we want to reclaim a Protestant wisdom that is full of that richness, fully rounded kind of intellectual approach. And I think we keep coming back to Lewis because Lewis just embodies that. He is not He's sort of an honorary evangelical, isn't he, Lewis? But he was not evangelical in many ways, not probably classically fully reformed in many ways, but, card-carrying Anglican, very much had every opportunity in the world to become a Roman Catholic, did not do so. It's clear at different points about why that was. But Lewis embodies that tradition and is maybe the last really great mind to do that, and to have been growing up at a time and entering the academy at a time where you could still have that kind of cohesive whole rounded education. And so we just keep coming back to Lewis for that reason. He just embodies so much of what we've been about for the last 10 plus years.
I love that. I think it's a great description of Lewis, and it's important, at least for, I don't know how many of folks like me are in our audience today, but I grew up as a Southern Baptist from Tennessee and Virginia, actively assuming that C.S. Lewis was basically a Southern Baptist. I didn't know what these funny Anglicans were. I'd never met any of those folks. But as I got older, when I would go back to Narnia, and particularly, I remember it was it's the scene in the last battle where the giant Time squeezes out the sun. It suddenly hit me that this is not happening in any kind of short time frame. Then I went back and read kind of the description of Charn and Magician's Nephew. I was like, whoa, whatever else Lewis is, this is not some kind of 6-day, 24-hour creationist perspective. It's something different. And when I was looking at
Narnia is made in way less than 6 days. It's way more fundamentalist than like Ken Ham.
Oh, 100%. And but then the more I got to know about Lewis, I mean, there are some American evangelical social habits. I mean, Lewis drank and smoked a lot. That features prominently in all the descriptions of the Inklings, and that makes my particular tribe very nervous. They're not over there handing that to little kids, thinking, "Be like this author." And yet
it's either that or it's kind of fetishized, and it's okay for him to be doing it over there, this Oxford Don, smoking away and sort of slurring his words, half cut on sherry at 4:30 in the afternoon. But yeah, and he sort of then becomes this sort of storybook figure. But similarly, I think and this is ultimately to Lewis's credit, that he embodies that mere Christianity in so many ways. But yeah, similarly, I think didn't have a wider appreciation of who Lewis really was until I was into my 20s, really.
Well, and in my work now, I do a lot with classical education here in the United States, and we come back to Lewis all the time for the exact same reasons you mentioned. I mean, he is a great place to be able to see the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition thriving with such a strong attention to logic and sort of a rightly framed universal Christianity. He has a Christian perspective, but it's not a tribal, it's not a narrow perspective. And that's really helpful for a lot of our projects.
And I think you go through the bell curve with Lewis. Do people know the bell curve meme with the troglodyte, low intellect guy at the start, and then the seething middle brow guy, and then the savant wise man at the end. And you do that with Lewis, where you first discover it's like, oh, this is great, and then you sort of think, he's not that great, and then you push through true genius level intellect, and people just have not even begun to scrape the surface of just how wise and intelligent and capable Lewis was.
Well, I think one of the places people tend to kind of make that move to the savant Lewis side is probably whenever they encounter the Ransom Trilogy. And I think Lewis is definitely rightly famous for Narnia. Narnia has been, I'm waiting with great fear and trepidation for the new Netflix adaptation of Narnia. But Narnia is kept alive in the public imagination through these constant remakings. No one, to my knowledge, has yet made the Ransom Trilogy into some kind of film or television series. But our subject today is the Ransom Trilogy. Rhys, could you do 3 things for me? Give people some kind of very brief introduction to the Ransom Trilogy. Tell us why we need a book of academic essays on the Ransom Trilogy. And also, why is there controversy about Ransom Trilogy versus Space Trilogy?
Okay, on the first one, and it's sort of overview, summary, whatever. I mean, I've been on a few podcasts talking about this book now, and this is always a funny question. I'm beginning to hone it because it's such a strange series in many ways, which is perhaps one of the reasons why it's not as popular as Narnia. But it's a science fiction trilogy, predominantly is the easiest way to think of it, where Lewis's protagonist, Elwyn Ransom, he's a university professor, is propelled into space, first to Mars and then to Venus, and the third novel takes place on Earth, into a cosmic universe where, in short, aliens exist and Christianity is true. I think that's the best way of framing the whole thing, as well as the Arthurian legends, which becomes a part in the
just
third,
because Lewis loves Arthur. Arthur is real.
Yeah, and it's so sort of high concept on that level that like you almost wouldn't get away with it now. It sounds like fanfic, sort of Reddit level stuff, or something that we'd only maybe get in like a graphic novel. But it's a science fiction trilogy in which aliens are real, Christianity is true, and so is the medieval cosmos and the medieval view of the universe, which is perhaps, in certain ways, which is perhaps the least known element of the whole thing, which is curious to people. So that's my brief overview. What was the second question?
Why a book of academic essays on this trilogy? I mean, as I'm sure you know, there are plenty of trilogies of science fiction novels from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Why a collection of essays on this one?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, they are academic essays. Pretty much everybody involved is a scholar of some kind. We have Michael Ward, who is the greatest Lewis scholar around. Great privilege to have worked with him on this. As we said, there's a huge amount of Lewis secondary literature, a huge amount of books sort of applying Lewis to the Christian life. Joe Rigney, who is one of our contributors to this, wrote a book called Live Like a Narnian. But there is nothing around at the kind of popular secondary literature level, and even the kind of more accessible and useful academic level on the Ransom Trilogy. It's been hugely underserved. And so as I was introduced to this, and this is only in the last several years since coming into the orbit of the Davenant Institute, I began to think, why has no one told me about this before? Because there's so much in these trilogies that is rich for the Christian life that you could use as a sermon illustration, or that could be used in a book to help people think through some theological concept for how they live. And it's so much about the particular problems of the modern world that Lewis saw as we were coming out of World War II, that it is more and more relevant all the time. And so it seemed exactly like the right moment to pull together some essays, raise the profile of the trilogy, try and get people who are aware of it, who maybe tried it once, to dive into it, and then provide some secondary literature that can help them to think it all through, because it's so rich. I think it is helpful to have some other stuff to help guide you through it. So it seemed to us that there was a moment for it. It's incredibly relevant, so much of the book, and there is not that kind of secondary literature on the Ransom Trilogy that you have with Narnia, both at the popular and more useful academic level. And I think also Michael Ward's Planet Narnia came out in 2009, revolutionized the world of Lewis studies, and I do think there's a sort of before Ward and after Ward divide, to be honest, in Lewis studies, and so there is plenty of stuff written in Lewis studies over the years prior to Ward's book, but not so much, certainly not that I thought was overly useful since then. So wanted to do a post-Ward contribution. Yeah. And then there was a third thing. What was the third?
Well, before we go to the third thing, a couple quick follow-up comments on that. We actually have a live stream audience today, which is not always the case. So I'm excited we have one today. For our live stream audience, I'm sorry you won't be able to join us. We are not live streaming the conversation with Dr. Ward. You'll have to tune in to the dropping of the season. But Dr. Ward is actually my next podcast guest. He's going to be talking about his essay about marriage and contraception in the Ransom Trilogy.
He who comes after me is greater than I.
And I will, since you mentioned Joe Rigney, just want to quickly shout out his episode back in season 6. He came on and we talked about his, I think, still most recent book, but he now has another book that is on the horizon. But
the spicy sequel.
Yes, it was his first book on therapeutic leadership or the one on
Emotional
emotional
sabotage. Yeah.
sabotage. So great conversation. And I've not read his Live Like a Narnian, but my friend Sean Hadley just recently recommended that one as his favorite Joe Rigney read. So I'm glad to hear a couple other past and future optimistic curmudgeons are connected to this book. That's marvelous. The third thing I was going to ask you about in that overly complicated question was why is there a discrepancy between these are published as the Space Trilogy. I have the old volumes of the Space Trilogy at home on my shelf. But the title of this book, once again, for anyone playing the drinking game for this episode, here is the product placement. Why is this called C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy on the cover?
Yes, well, there's a deep irony that it is branded as by its publisher and generally referred to as, which I presume is the fault of the publisher, the Space Trilogy, because there is a protracted section in the first book, Out of the Silent Planet, about why space is a bad name for space. So I mentioned one of the key things, aliens exist, Christianity is true, and the medieval cosmos is basically true. Now, Lewis really unpacks this in his book, The Discarded Image. In the medieval view of the universe, as most people crudely know one element of it, the Earth is at the center. And then the universe is a series of spheres going outwards from the Earth. And each of these spheres, certainly the ones immediately kind of above the Earth, is governed by one of the planets. That doesn't mean the actual planets that we know in the solar system, but planets comes from the Latin word for wanderers, the things you can see moving around the sky. So Mercury, Venus, Mars, the Moon, Saturn, Jupiter. I've forgotten something because the Sun. Did I say the Sun?
You did not say the Sun. We got to have the fields of Arbol.
Yeah. So each of the spheres is going to be governed by one of these spheres. And these things all have certain personalities and qualities. So the sun is bright, the metal it induces is gold, it's regal, many things like that. Jupiter is jovial and kingly, and the metal it induces is tin. The moon is to do with madness and is actually sort of negative in certain ways, and things like that. So in the medieval view of the universe, as you move out into the beyond the Earth, what you have is not empty space, but in fact a universe of spheres full of energy and light and life and music as well. The medievals believed that as these spheres turned on each other, they made music that we cannot hear. And so the whole medieval view of the universe, this says in the Discarded Image, is of a cathedral. And it's not, you don't imagine it as consisting of things that are distant from you, which is a kind of cold clinical idea, but merely things that are high above you, like you've walked into a cathedral with, cornices and decorations and stained glass and all sorts of things. And so Ransom gets into Freudian slip, into space, and realizes that space is a bad name for it, and actually it is more properly understood as the heavens. And Lewis is trying to reconcile this medieval view of the universe, which is not literally true, with a modern cosmology where we know the Earth is not at the center, and we're in the Milky Way and wherever we are in the universe. Lewis knows that is literally true, but he's trying to retain the sort of spiritual truth of the old model and bring it into this. So it is inexplicable to me. It's purely commercial, I assume, to have called the thing the Space Trilogy. Cosmic Trilogy is also acceptable. Some of the printed editions will have that written on it, but we wanted to make Ransom Trilogy great again and try and see if we could set the tone and make that the default thing that it's called. So time will tell if we are successful.
Hopefully you are. I know. I don't remember where I was, but I was somewhere and I referenced reading the Space Trilogy. I got shouted down by a group of Lewis fans around me. They were further ahead on the journey.
Professor Ward, to his credit, he responded to my email asking him if he wanted to join the project within the hour, which was wonderful. And he did say to me that if you had called it the Space Trilogy, I would have said no. So that was gratifying.
That's wonderful. I love that moment in Out of the Silent Planet because I think it shows what Lewis really is hoping to do with his novel. Like he wants to remind his reader, don't think that the world around you is neutral. The world around you is constantly shaping you. You are influenced by this. And he doesn't mean it quite the same way that David Foster Wallace quote about being the fish in the fish bowl and the not knowing about water is. He means instead like the world is constantly mythologizing us. We're learning a story to explain the world. And Lewis wants to tell a more true story. So the problem with space for him, I think, at least particularly in that passage, is that space connotes death and cold vacuity, he says. Whereas the heavens connote life and this network of life-giving locations. And he sort of paints an image of the cosmos as this living field of light, that the planets are actually like dropped into the field. And it's a totally different way of imagining reality. Though it too, as he says at the very end of Discarded Image, I mean, he just, I love his honesty at the end there. Where he says, this whole thing is so beautiful. It only suffers from the one fault of not being true, but I still love it. Hopefully we can all have that much humility with the ideas that we love that just happen to suffer from not being true. One last precursor question before I really want to get into your essay particularly, because you wrote such a fascinating essay about pleasure in Perelandra. But talk to us a little bit as an editor before you talk to us as an author. What were some of your favorite essays to work with in this collection? I just want to name drop a few people real quick. In this volume are essays by Louis Marcos, Holly Ordway, Joseph Minnick, Michael Ward, Colin Redimer, and at least 6 or 7 other people. But those were the names that I've recognized as like, oh, those are people I want to read. So talk to us a little bit about your favorite essays to work with and some of the ideas that they convey.
Yeah, well, Professor Ward's one on the hideous strength and contraception is outstanding, and a real honor to get to work on that and publish that. It expands a shorter piece that he wrote for First Things a couple of years ago, and there's just a lot of new scholarly content in that in terms of the references and influences on Lewis when it comes to what is essentially a sustained critique of contraception throughout the hideous strength. That's fantastic, and despite being so sort of rich in scholarly footnotes and whatnot, is immediately and uncomfortably practical in its implications for people. Jake Meador's essay on bureaucratic speech in that hideous strength, I really liked, and I specifically asked Jake to write that because I thought he'd be excellent at it, and he was. Which I think, reading that hideous strength the first time, is the thing that most stood out to me. And I don't laugh out loud as I read very often, but I laughed out loud a lot in that hideous strength, in those sections where the NICE characters are talking and just blithering and covering over everything in what we now recognize as kind of corporate HR speak. Lewis anticipated that and saw it already doing its thing in the early 1940s. And Jake does a great job, I think, of showing how that habit has ensconced itself sort of, anywhere you look on the political spectrum or in any faction in the culture wars, if you want to call it that. That was really, really fantastic. And Colin Smothers' one on masculinity is such an obvious, topic in Out of the Silent Planet, but there was no just go-to clear kind of summative place that just draws together everything that Lewis is doing with that. And I'm just, Colin's one, I feel like I particularly created something that this is a go-to. Masculinity in Out of the Silent Planet, go read Colin Smothers' essay. Colin emerged sort of from the ether in that as I was thinking about who I could get to do that, and he works for the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and then also has written a lot about Lewis, and had written a piece a while ago saying he was committing himself in whatever year it was to read everything that Lewis had written. So I like, this guy will know his stuff. So those are 3 that really stood out to me throughout the editing process, but I was overwhelmingly pleased with everybody.
I'm still working through the various essays in here. will tell you, since you recommended this one to me, I did read Susanna. I need to get her last name.
Black Roberts.
Yes,
Black, whichever
her conception, her framing of the problem of Susan was just brilliant. It was an excellent consideration of another not true view of Lewis, but certainly very popular, very widespread critique of Lewis that I've seen in a lot of places. Folks who have not read Lewis will sometimes say, "Oh, he's the guy who condemned Susan to hell," and Susanna just takes that claim to task and shows actually there's something so much deeper, so much more interesting than that happening. And if you stop on that, not only are you doing violence to Lewis and to Narnia, but you're also really ignoring this much deeper truth about human nature. And it was just a great essay.
Yeah, also fantastic. And I think Susanna also someone I very much thought this is the person I want to write this essay, and was very glad to get her to. She was late in submitting it, which she has been very public about. But I was very glad to get it in the end, and it worked out exactly how I'd hoped. So, yeah.
Well, let's turn to your article. You wrote about pleasure in Perelandra, and I have to confess, it was one of the first ones I read in this collection because Perelandra is my favorite of the three. So walk us through what Lewis is suggesting about pleasure in this novel, and we might get to some of the distinctions, but kind of broadly speaking, what's going on with pleasure and Perelandra?
Yeah, sure. So, Perelandra, as I've discovered, I think I say this in a footnote, maybe in the intro, as I've worked on this book, discovered Perelandra is the fan favorite. That Hideous Strength is the one that everybody knows and is justly the most famous, I think. But Perelandra is the fan favorite. It's the Return of the Jedi of the trilogy, and certainly was for me. And as I read through the trilogy the first time, that's the one that really stuck with me and that I wanted to go back to, and immediately had ideas about how it could apply to the Christian life and what I would want to write about it. The remarkable thing about Perelandra is Lewis creates a paradise, and it is an exercise in trying to give us a sense and a taste, use those words advisedly, of what it would be like to live in an unfallen material world, which is ultimately knowledge that's impossible for us, but Lewis sort of has a damn good try and uses it as a bit of a thought experiment. But Lewis does write his fiction to convey messages and to change you. He really does. It's not reductionistic. You could mount a sort of criticism of that, say, "Oh, that's not what literature's for," blah, blah, blah. But that's what Lewis is doing, as far as I'm concerned. You can call it didactic if you want, but that's what he's doing. And so it occurred to me, well, he's giving us this glimpse of perfect pleasure, unfallen pleasure. What use is that to me as an unfallen being? And as I meditated on that, three sort of key uses for it emerged, and that's the three main categories that I lay out in the essay. So the thing that I start with is it gives you a way of naming pleasure. So as Ransom moves through Perelandra and encounters all of its wonders, these different things he tastes and eats, each one is a very distinct kind of physical pleasure. So he has this gourd that is an ecstatic, mind-blowing, nearly kind of orgasmic level pleasure. It just kind of blows his mind. But then he also finds other stuff, these little almond-shaped things that are just the pleasure of plain food, and numerous other ones. And I suggest you could make a sort of taxonomy of different kinds of taste and kind of vibe that Lewis gets from these different things. And what that seemed to do to me is, create a taxonomy of pleasure is not uniform or monochrome. There's this kind of pleasure and this kind of pleasure. And it is a wonderful thing actually to be able to stop as you are enjoying a physical pleasure that God has put in the world, and to say that is this kind of pleasure. This is just the sometimes you come home and you don't want an elaborate gourmet meal. You want the pleasure of plain food. meat and potatoes, cold winter night. That's what I needed. And then sometimes you want the extravagant thing with the foam and the bits of vegetable kind of carved and shaven into elaborate shapes, and just a little tiny morsel that is incredibly expensive. It's a different kind of pleasure, and it then it pushes you to a kind of posture of attentiveness, I think, to the material pleasures that come your way in any given day, to stop and pause and name those things. And naming is a human instinct. It's Adamic. The first thing that Adam does and isn't even told to do, but does, is name things. God brings things to Adam to see what he will name them. He never commands Adam to name anything. Adam just does it, as God has been doing, names things. First, I think Lewis gives us this kind of idea of naming pleasures. Then he gives us some rationale for restraining pleasures. So Ransom tastes this wonderful ecstatic gourd, and some bit of logic, or that he thinks is logic, says to him, well, that was so good, obviously you should do it again. Why would you not? But then another part of him senses that, no, that is not how I should treat this thing. Gilbert Meilander, who is often totally unknown as someone who ever wrote on Lewis, but did early in his career, I think it was his PhD thesis, says that Perelandra is about our appropriate relation to created things, which is very much flush with Lewis talking about the Tao, or the Tao in The Abolition of Man. There is a doctrine of objective value, which is both about what things are, and also about how we should feel towards certain things. And it's a similar thing here. You've encountered this pleasure, whether it's the ecstatic pleasure, the pleasure of plain food, whatever it might be. What is the correct response to that? And part of that is, well, how immediately should you do it again? And with the ecstatic pleasure, he says, no, that would be like listening to the same symphony twice in a day. It would be inappropriate to do that. So I'll not do that. Now, Christians have many rationales for restraining our passions and our pursuit of sensual pleasure. We don't want to breed vice and become worse and worse. We just plain don't want to sin. We love Christ and want to obey him, and he's our highest good, etc. But this is a new idea I felt from Lewis, that another reason you should restrain the pursuits of pleasure, or conduct your pursuits of certain pleasures in certain ways, is just because of the thing itself. You honor the thing in choosing to restrain yourself in certain ways. You honor Christ by not doing so sinfully. You honor yourself, treating your body as a temple. But you can honor the thing. You honor the pleasure by treating it in a certain way. And we just have so much at our fingertips in terms of pleasure in the modern world, things we can look at, how easy it is to listen to the same symphony twice in a day, which is curious to me because Lewis had records, so he could listen to the same symphony twice in a day, but perhaps he would choose not to, or maybe he's thinking of actually going to and assembling and attending the same symphony being played twice in a day, which would of course be incredibly elaborate. But to think that actually it would be wrong for me to treat this pleasure in this way just because of what it is was a really rich thought for me.
There might be something there too about the unique nature of that pleasure, because in that moment, I mean, just Ransom is so knocked on his face about how great this fruit is, and there's something about the fruit there as a gift and returning unnecessarily. There's something about the gift that runs throughout Perelandra. Part of what Ransom has to learn throughout there is that he has to trust Maleldil's will to provide for him everything that he needs. And so going back to it just because he wants it is going back to it for his sake, not to receive it as given. So there's something, I wonder if there's something there too in distinguishing the nature, if symphony is the right kind of comparison, like a symphony is some kind of great, grand piece of music. It's it takes immense artistry for an ensemble or a gathered orchestra to play a symphony correctly, and to finish that and say, like, the right response would just be to bask in it and then contemplate the effect of that symphony. But to finish a 3-4 hour symphonic experience and then say, all right, go ahead, everybody play it again. Like there's something ungrateful to the people who have just performed this symphony in some way. So I wonder if that too speaks to the nature of that pleasure. But I think you're spot on with the naming and the restraining piece there.
A great illustration of that has occurred to me only since finishing it. Have you ever watched the movie The Death of Stalin?
I don't think so. No.
It's a very, very funny comedy, British cast about the death of Stalin. And it's this farce of all the USSR, Politburo, chasing their tails, trying to get one over each other while Stalin lies dead in the next room. But at the beginning, it begins with a symphony being played, and Stalin's listening to it on the radio. And then he calls up the broadcaster and says, "I want a recording of that sent to me this evening." And it hasn't been recorded. And the musicians are already beginning to leave, and the audience have left, and so they're all scrambling around trying to assemble. To get random kind of Russian peasants in from the street to fill it out. The director faints and cracks his head open, so they have to go and get another conductor to kind of, and just the absurdity of assembling the symphony again for the second time in a night is evident to everybody. And that's Stalin, tyrant, who can demand anything that he wants, will not accept. That pleasure was that pleasure of the moment. There'll be another pleasure to come soon, but it's not that one that I had earlier. But it's that desire to gain something again, to have it over, the sin of encore or thereabouts, he calls it at a certain point. That is the essence of sin in Perelandra for Lewis, is the desire to have again. And then this takes us to the third point. So the naming, restraining, and then embracing pleasure. These, those second two really are two sides of the same coin. That you embrace the pleasure that's given to you. And the kind of quote at the head of the chapter is the Green Lady saying, "Every joy is beyond all others. The fruit we are eating is always the best fruit of all." And part of her kind of temptation, struggle that she goes through is when she first sees Ransom, she initially is hoping and thinking that he is her husband, is Tor, the Green Man, the king of Perelandra. But it's not. And she's then wrestling with this idea of, I anticipated one pleasure, but was given another. And what she must learn to do in her internal dialogue with Maleldil is to embrace the pleasure that he's given. And I began to think about, use this phrase as providential pleasure. When we think about God's providence, we tend to actually mean his sort of orchestration of bad and sad things. And that's when we tend to bring up the doctrine of providence, is when things have gone bad and things are sad. This is all God's providence. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. But that includes his good wonders, like his outright unmitigated good wonders, as well as the way that he, works all things together for our good. Pleasure is providential. And so we should receive the pleasure at hand gratefully as a gift, like you say, rather than wishing it was something else or trying to repeat a pleasure that we had at another time.
It's a truly great essay. I really enjoyed reading it and thinking through these different variations. I think you captured really well the particularities that Lewis brings out in Perelandra in particular. That I think it's those particularities that let us see the idea that he's developing. You mentioned earlier that like Lewis is trying to change the reader, and I think it's important to distinguish between sort of a didactic novel. I don't even know if it's truly a novel, but my go-to comparison is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. I mean, it is impossible to miss the point.
Sorry, kind of.
Well, and Lewis, I think is doing something very different. It is possible to completely miss what Lewis is doing. Like you have to read carefully, you have to think about it. You might have to read it 2, 3, 4 times. You have to talk about it with somebody. But what he's doing is planting these images that rest in our minds, and they sort of bear much fruit as they flower. And it's in that sense that Russell Kirk listed Lewis as one of the great practitioners of the moral imagination in one of his essays. So like Lewis actually is trying to strengthen the reader's ability to perceive much in what is around him. And I think that's what he does here.
And yet Lewis loves Pilgrim's Progress. His first book is The Pilgrim's Regress, his own, version of it. And he mentions Pilgrim's Progress many, many times. He clearly regards it as a great work of literature. I think it's even mentioned in That Hideous Strength when he's talking about Bracton College and it feeling like a lovely little Protestant place or something like that. It makes you want to go and read Walton's Lives, and I think Bunyan gets a mention. Bunyan gets a mention as sort of the Protestant vibe at different points. So yeah, I wonder if I'm going through the bell curve with Pilgrim's Progress, because I for a long time was very much on this is overly didactic, like kind of beat me over the head sort of literature, but Lewis thought very highly of it, so that makes me reconsider. I have yet to sit down and read the unabridged original any time recently, though. We read a kids abridged version when we go on holiday with our kids. So who knows? Maybe the sort of intellectual reappraisal of Pilgrim's Progress is yet to come.
If you do find yourself in that position, let me know. I'll pick up a copy. It's been about 20 years since I've read it, and we could come back and do a great books episode about John Bunyan. Rhys, as I'm watching our time, as we're kind of closing in on the end here, two last things. We still sometimes our live stream audience comes and goes, but we still have a lot of people tuning in. Listeners and viewers, if you have a question or a comment, please do put that in on whatever platform you're watching this on, and that'll show up here. And I'll take those towards the end of the episode if it makes sense to do so. But Rhys, one last question for you. This is going to be an episode that will air as part of season 8, and one of my hopes for season 8 is to have this running theme of reenchantment. I think one of the in the United States right now, there is on the right, at least, there's a sense of like, we just might have had some sort of win. And just maybe we can undo some of the bad things that our federal government has done over the last 4 years. And there are plenty of people who
we have the opposite problem. Oh, no, the opposite sensation.
Yes. Well, I hope you guys too managed to figure out something better than your current conundrum. But I think a lot of people look at that as like the most important thing that we could do on the right is actually the Department of Governmental Efficiency and just cutting some different programs. I think Doge is great. I think it's a great idea. I really hope they can actually do something. But I have a different thesis. I think the most important thing anyone in conservatism can do is actually recover a sense of reenchantment and recover storytelling as a habit on the right. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you this question at the end of today's conversation. In what way does Lewis's Ransom Trilogy reenchant our minds kind of out of modernity?
Very good question. I do talk about enchantment and reenchantment a bit in the introduction. I very much think that Lewis is tapping into that, and the whole idea of space versus the heavens, I think, is Lewis riding this train. I think Lewis does it in what is still a very distinctly orthodox, historic Christian way. So there's all this sort of shift towards enchantment on the right, as you say, but then so much of it is still the kind of Jordan Peterson sub-Christian vibing on enchantment, which refuses to make concrete leaps as to the historic truth of Christianity. Whereas I think Lewis is all about true myth, and so that's what he's trying to do with combining the medieval cosmos and the modern cosmos, to say yes, the Earth is not the center of the universe. Yes, the moon is not covered in holes from an angelic battle and doesn't cause madness. But the qualities that we have associated with those heavenly bodies and like the relevant, small g pagan gods over the years, those are real things. They're real because God is real, and those things ultimately inhere in God, and they are in creation because they are reflections of Him. And things are. I've written a little bit about this. I dislike the enchantment framing because I think it suggests that you need to kind of encrust something onto reality, to sprinkle fairy dust onto it. An enchantment is an incantation. It is something that you do to put magic on something. Whereas I think the real Christian answer to enchantment, and I'll go out and say it, I think the Protestant tradition guards this better, is that reality does not need to be re-enchanted. It's not even enchanted. It's just magic. Because that's how God made it, and it is brimming with all of these things, because it was made by God. So yeah, I've sort of rambled slightly, but I think Lewis embodies that sense, that reality does not need to be enchanted or re-enchanted. It's already magic, and you don't need extra little things like relics and looking for synchronicity to find that. You need the concrete truth of Christianity, and just to appreciate the world for what it is.
I think maybe to put that in Narnian terms, like the Narnia already thrums with the magic of Aslan's song. That creation is there, and we have the misfortune of being born into an era that has, in many ways, deadened itself. We perhaps resemble Uncle Andrew a lot more than we resemble Diggory or Polly.
Yeah, and Andrew is a magician in sort of old typical sense of that. He's sort of using human ingenuity, essentially sort of, magic indistinguishable from a science, to access and tap into to magical stuff. Whereas Aslan is just Aslan, and Narnia is just brimming with magical life. Yeah.
Well, and so too, in that sense, is the world that the real God has made. It too is brimming with all kinds of vitality, and it does in fact belong to us to appreciate and steward all that God has made. Well, Rhys, we've had one question come in, so this officially is my. I don't know that I've ever had anybody from the Netherlands pop in before on this, so kudos to you for bringing in the European audience. So we've got a question from Seth from the Netherlands. He's been reading essays from Kierkegaard. So Rhys, I'll just toss this your way. Are you familiar with Kierkegaard's works, and how would you position Kierkegaard in conversation with C.S. Lewis?
I'm not overly familiar with Kierkegaard. I will out myself there. I have read Fear and Trembling in its entirety, and have some working familiarity with the rest of his works, but I don't think I have read another Kierkegaard cover to cover. But I think I know enough to know that Kierkegaard is hugely misunderstood in terms of kind of being labeled as an existentialist, and what he means by a leap of faith. I do think, I've just been told my battery is going to run out, so I'll go and grab my power cord in a second. But I think what Kierkegaard really means when he is talking about kind of his existentialist individual leap of faith is made in the context of a dead church, where the individual must commit themselves rather than receiving secondhand. And I think, as Lewis, I owe a lot to my colleague Joe Minnick for this thought. Lewis kind of sees us moving through the modern problems that we live in, and Lord willing, reaching a greater maturity at the end of that. This is the story of Mark and Jane, really. But the individual must go through a submission on the other side of modernity to the creator. So I think maybe you could frame Mark and Jane's kind of conversion story. I think Jane's converted by the end. Mark still has a way to go, I think, as I read him. But that could be a kind of Kierkegaardian recommittal and submission and leap of faith, to talk about one bit of Kierkegaard. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go grab my power cord, and I'll be back with you.
All right. Well, while you're doing that, I'll take a stab at Seth's question. Thanks for the comment, Seth. I've published one essay on Kierkegaard. I am by no means a Kierkegaard expert. I've read Fear and Trembling and then selections from Either Or and a couple small sermons. But I think what my favorite part about Kierkegaard is where he resembles Socrates. And he just is provoking people to consider whether or not what they truly think is true is actually true. I think he and Lewis have a lot in common in that respect. Like they're both they're both dealing with people who think they know what truth is, and they have this internal compulsion to cause people who actually are wrong to realize that they're wrong. I think that's I was at a conference last September where somebody was talking about Lewis's years in the Socratic Club at Oxford. And I don't know who's going to do this work, but someone needs to do the work of studying a lot of the records from that time and looking at Lewis's time in a debate setting. So I think that is somewhat similar to his connection to Kierkegaard, I think. Though Kierkegaard's deeply confusing and also problematic in that he never puts his name to anything, which Lewis was perfectly happy to put his name to something. So that might be a difference.
Yeah, well, but they do, thinking on it a little more, they do both have something of an interest in writing, esoterically. So, Kierkegaard writes, under these pseudonyms and sort of mystery boxes within mystery boxes. And Lewis, this is laid out somewhat in the intro of Planet Narnia. Lewis does his own esotericism. So the whole kind of planetary influences hidden in plain sight in Narnia is the chief example. Yes, he could put his own name to things, but he was known to all and sundry as Jack, a name he chose for himself. He writes to Arthur Greaves. They call each other Galahad and something else. It's slipping my mind now. There are.
Oh, Rhys, did we lose you?
A little bit about some.
Oh, you're back. Good.
Oh, hello. Sorry, did you?
We lost that last.
Other little esoteric moments in Lewis. I've written about some sort of slightly rude jokes. I think Lewis hides in plain sight sometimes. So, he has a penchant for esotericism, which is not entirely dissimilar to Kierkegaard.
We've got one more question that came in. We're going to take this as our last question. So thank you to our viewers for joining us today. Our last question comes from Mike Tyndall. Mike says, thank you for the great conversation. In the introduction, you mentioned the pastoral wisdom and applicability of the Ransom Trilogy. Can you share how that has helped you personally? I've got a thought on this one too, but Rhys, start us off on this one.
Yeah, well, this is, I think I know this, Mike. So hi, Mike. How has it helped me personally? I think the stuff I wrote about in my essay in terms of pleasure has been helpful in being thankful and observant and joyful in the world that God's made, and in restraining my vices. I genuinely think so. That hideous strength, I think, is, I have said this a few times, essentially a marriage prep text, if you read it in a certain way. So seeing Mark and Jane working through what it means to be men and women, husband and wife in modernity, has been really transformative. Taking ownership of how God has made myself, how God has made my wife, what the ends of our marriage are. The famously the opening word of that hideous strength is matrimony, and Jane is there thinking about what in the prayer book is given as the third purpose of marriage, which is mutual help and companionship, but she is not mentioning and has overlooked and has no interest in the first two, which are for the procreation of children and the restraint of lust. And this is very much feeding into Michael Ward's chapter about the book as a critique of contraception. So I think helping us to enthusiastically embrace what a marriage is meant to be has been very helpful. And I just often find myself thinking of little snippets and scenes of Mark and Jane's marriage in my own. Yeah, so those would be the two most obvious ones. The stuff I read about in my own essay and the kind of marital wisdom of the hideous strength. Yeah, what about you, Josh?
Well, the piece that comes to my mind is I've told this story in a few other places, so this is public, but I'm gonna keep names blurred for very obvious reasons. But answering this question actually lies at the root of my dissertation. I was working as an interim assistant principal at a high school, and this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago at this point. And it was kind of relatively early in not truly early in like the trans craze, but early enough that it was my school's first issue of dealing with a girl who wanted to go into the boys' bathroom. And I my boss knew that I would have strong views on this. So she told me about this after she'd already made her decision about how she was going to handle this. And I was struggling with like, how exactly do I express why I think that was the wrong decision? Because my boss is telling her that violates Genesis 1 and 2 is going to be a meaningless statement in that context. And I found myself reaching for, I needed non-biblical language to articulate the fact that gender and sexuality are real categories and they're not transferable. And it was the first time I'd really come up with that need. And it took me a couple of years, but I found the language I was looking for, and it's in Perelandra. It's in the confusing, trippy last 10 pages where Lewis sort of develops
the weird theodicy. Yeah.
Yep. Neoplatonic theory of gender, and it's marvelous. But that has been it's been very reassuring to me to know, in reference back to what you said earlier, Rhys. I mean, that Lewis was Protestant. We don't have to, it's not like we were all waiting for John Paul II to write Theology of the Body to realize, oh yeah, the body matters. Lewis actually articulated an incredibly robust understanding of masculinity and femininity as tied to the body long before transgenderism was medically possible or normal. He just came up with, and the resources are there. So I've found that to be a very helpful piece of Lewis, and to be able to then incorporate that into various presentations and teachings to, because I don't, Rhys, I don't know what this looks like in the UK, but in the States, there are lots of traditional Christian families that are looking for good answers, but have zero interest in reading dozens of books that are mostly junk about that kind of issue. And being able to kind of say, hey, actually, this trusted theological voice that you already know, C.S. Lewis, he's got some great stuff on this, that actually resonates really well. So thank you, Mike, for the question. I hope those thoughts were helpful to you. Rhys, as we wrap up today, how can people find and follow your work online?
Sure. Well, you can find me on Twitter. It will be called Twitter till I die, at RD Laverty. And I also write a Substack called The New Albion. So you can find that on Substack, or it has a custom domain name now. So you can go to www.thenewalbion.co.uk, and that'll take you there as well. I try to write regularly. I have small children and a full-time job, so writing ebbs and flows with the fortunes of those things. But thus far, 2025, I'm more regular than I was towards the end of 2024. Try and do British cultural commentary from a Christian perspective there, so that my conservative American brothers don't have a monopoly on such things. Yeah, that's where you can find me. And go and please do follow the Davenant Institute. Visit davenantinstitute.org to see more of what we do. You can sign up there for our mailing list. You can follow us on Twitter at Davenant Inst. We're also on Instagram. We are also on the other place at Blue Sky, if you are the sort of sensible individual who thinks that's the place to be at the minute. Facebook as well. Yeah.
Marvelous. Well, Rhys, thank you so much for today's conversation. This has been delightful.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Really great to be here. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in, and go and get the book if you haven't already.
Indeed. Well, thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Rhys Laverty, and the book is Life on the Silent Planet, Essays on Christian Living from C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please do find and follow us on X and on YouTube. On X, you can find me as at The Optimistic C3, and on YouTube, just search for Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want to make sure that you have the ability to find and follow all of our content. And then if you're looking at the show description, you'll see links to any resources that were referenced in the show, as well as the sponsors for this episode. Please do check those out. We are very grateful for a variety of different institutions in helping to make this show possible. Until next time, seek the good, enjoy the true, and live the beautiful.